Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the history of the Catholic Church in the United States. Picking up where we left off last time, Archbishop John Carroll of Baltimore died in 1815, and he died on December 3rd, 1815, and he was followed as second Archbishop of Baltimore by Leonard Neale, Neale, a Jesuit priest. Neale was born in Port Tobacco, Maryland, when it was still a colony of Great Britain, on the October 15th, 1746. His father's name was William Neale, and his mother's maiden name was Anne Brooke. 6 of their 7 sons became Jesuits. Leonard Neale attended the same schools as John Carroll, Bohemia Manor, near his home in Maryland. Then at the age of 12, he was sent to Europe, studied at the College of St. Omer, and later continued his studies in Bruges and Liège. Neale became a member of the Jesuits, and after its suppression in 1773, still pursued ordination as a secular priest, which occurred on the 5th of June, 1777. Returning home to Maryland during the American Revolution, his ship was captured by the Royal Navy, and he was incarcerated as a prisoner of war until the war ended in 1783. So 6 years he was and this is a non-combatant, that he still was kept in jail. Finally made it back to Maryland in April of 1783, placed himself at the service of John Carroll. Assigned first to Philadelphia, Father Neale remained at his post during a horrific yellow fever epidemic, about which I made a video, the 1793 epidemic, which killed 10% of the population. He contracted yellow fever himself, but survived, yet his stamina never fully returned. He opened St. Mary's orphanage for the children of the victims, the children whose parents died, and he continued to serve as pastor of St. Mary's Parish in Philadelphia. In 1799, Neale was appointed to succeed Louis William de Bourgh as the 4th president of Georgetown College in Washington, D.C. In the same year, Neale founded Georgetown Visitation Preparatory School under the direction of the Visitation nuns. At Bishop John Carroll's request to Rome, Neale was appointed his coadjutor, and Carroll ordained him a bishop in 1800 in the old St. Peter's Church, which was functioning as the pro-cathedral, while the current, what was going to be the official cathedral, and still is, of the Assumption, was being built. For those Maryland viewers, it was located at the northwestern corner of West Saratoga Street and North Charles Street in Baltimore. As Carroll had been ordained bishop in England, this was the first ordination of a Catholic bishop in the United States, in a part of the territory that was the United States. Neale, however, continued as president of Georgetown College, even after being ordained coadjutor bishop, until 1806. The pro-cathedral of St. Peter's, with its attached rectory, school, and surrounding cemetery, served as the episcopal seat until the dedication in 1821 of the New Baltimore Cathedral of the Assumption. In 1809, his brother, Francis Neale, also a Jesuit, and later the 6th president of Georgetown College, His nephew, William Matthews, also entered the Jesuits and also later became a president of Georgetown College. Neal succeeded Carroll as second Archbishop of Baltimore automatically. That's what coadjutor means, automatic successor. As soon as Carroll died on December 3rd, 1815. He served until his death, which was only 2 years later, on June 18th, 1817. Another brother, Charles Neal, was a leader of the Jesuit mission in America as when the Jesuit order was restored, which happened to be the same year, 1815. Then another brother, Charles, became the leader of the revived Jesuit mission in the United States. Now, rewinding, I mentioned earlier that Neal was appointed president of Georgetown College originally in 1799 when Louis William de Bourgh was assigned by Bishop Carroll to serve as administrator of the diocese in the two Floridas. And we've encountered this name a few times, in particular the letter that John Cowher wrote to James Madison about the newly acquired Louisiana Territory. So now he enters our story properly in his fullest capacity as the second bishop of New Orleans. So now we'll go into his life in more detail. Born in France on the February 16th, 1766. He was born to a French family in a French colony, not in the country that is now France. He was born on the island of Haiti when it was still the French colony of Saint-Domingue, but his parents were both of French blood. His father's name was Pierre, his mother is Marguerite. Pierre, his father, was a merchant from Bordeaux, whose business interest included a trading warehouse and a coffee plantation on the island that is now the nation of Haiti. Louis, the son, who became the bishop, was sent back to France at the age of 2 to live with his maternal grandparents in Bordeaux and to be educated in the home country. His early education was received at a royal school, the Collège de Guyenne. Deciding on ecclesiastical life, rather than following his father in business, de Bourgh entered the minor seminary of Saint-Sulpice in Paris. He enrolled on October 12, 1786. He completed his course, his training, and was ordained in 1788, after which he joined the Society of Saint-Sulpice, serving as a teacher. When the French Revolution turned violently against the church, de Bourgh was one of those who fled, first to his family at Bordeaux, and then, to avoid placing the family in jeopardy, left France altogether in August of 1792. He first went to Spain. Spain offered sanctuary to 6,322 refugee French priests. De Bourgh then took ship for Baltimore, arriving in December of 1794. Joining what up to that point was 1,500 ethnically French refugees who were from Saint-Domingue, who fled for other reasons, not the French Revolution, but the slave revolution on Haiti, which by this point was being led by Toussaint Louverture. De Bourgh was appointed to succeed Robert Molyneux as president of Georgetown College on October 1st, 1796, serving until 3 years, until 99. Then he was followed by Leonard Neal. In adherence to Carroll's accommodationist ecclesiology, de Bourgh hosted a visit to Georgetown by the retired president, George Washington, in 1797. And in return for that hospitality, on the 10th of July, 1798, de Bourgh was invited by Washington as a dinner guest to Mount Vernon. In August of the following year, 1799, Du Bourg became the first president of St. Mary's College in Baltimore, which we've already talked about, where he remained for 13 years. He obtained permission from the state of Maryland to run a lottery to fund the school. He was instrumental in assisting a religious order of women called the Poor Clares, also exiled from France, to open a school for girls in Georgetown. While preaching in New York, he captured the imagination of the young widow, whom we've already met, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, and he became one of her spiritual mentors after she came back to the United States, and formed a religious community, as we've already covered. For a time, he actually served as chaplain of her community of Sisters of Charity and advised their relocation from Baltimore to Emmitsburg, where their mother house was established and where the shrine of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton remains. Following Bishop Carroll's directions, in August of 1812, the Holy See named Du Bourg as Apostolic Administrator of Louisiana and the two Floridas during the Sede Vacante, which we've already mentioned. At the time of his arrival in New Orleans, corruption was rampant in both church and state. In terms of the church, which is our interest in this course, the dominant person in the local church was still Père Antoine, the Spanish Capuchin we've already met, the Antonio de Sedea, rector of the Cathedral of New Orleans. After Napoleon's final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, which coincided with the end of the War of 1812, Du Bourg returned to Europe to present the problems of the church in Louisiana to the Holy See. Before leaving, Du Bourg appointed another French émigré priest, Louis Sibourd, as administrator of the diocese. Père Antoine, rector of the cathedral, or schismatic rector of the cathedral, refused to acknowledge Sibourd's authority unless Du Bourg could show that he himself had the authority to appoint a vicar general, as he was not a bishop. Du Bourg was not a bishop yet. The newly freed from captivity, Pope Pius VII, responded with a letter to Archbishop Carroll confirming Sibourd as vicar general. This was followed by Du Bourg himself being appointed as bishop, as ordinary bishop. He was just a priest then, so he had to be ordained a bishop, which took place on the 24th of September, 1815, at the church of St. Louis, King of France, but the one in Rome. It's a French church in Rome. In the course of this journey, Du Bourg also recruited for his diocese. In northern Italy, his appeal among the Vincentians, the congregation of the mission, led to his first recruit, Felix de Andreas. De Andreas then recruited Joseph Rosati, who in time would become the first bishop of St. Louis, Missouri. Among other clergy who volunteered to serve were Leo Raymond de Necker and Antoine Blanc, who would become successive bishops of New Orleans, as well as Michael Portier, who would later become founding bishop of Mobile, Alabama. And we'll meet all of these guys as the course unfolds. The trustee schism maintained by Père Antoine in New Orleans induced the Ursuline superior, Mother Marie Olivier, to consider removing her sisters from New Orleans. But Bishop Du Bourg talked her into not only permitting them to stay, but also sending 9 more sisters. Du Bourg decided that the only solution to the trustee conflict was to simply abandon the city of New Orleans and start over. He remained in Europe for 2 years, recruiting clergy, raising money, and making alternate arrangements, which included, on the 11th of April, 1816, he received permission from the Holy See to reside as bishop in St. Louis, Missouri, rather than New Orleans. Now, St. Louis was part of the diocese at the time. Remember, initially it went from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, and essentially abandoned New Orleans, the city of New Orleans. He used, in St. Louis, he used St. Genevieve Church as his cathedral. His plan was to follow the successful template of the founding bishops of Quebec and Baltimore by establishing a local seminary. But de Bourg's would be in St. Louis, Missouri, not in New Orleans, Louisiana. De Bourgh left Bordeaux with more than 24 recruits on the 1st of July, 1817, arriving at Annapolis, Maryland on September 4th. Traveling by both stagecoach as well as steamboat, de Bourgh first reached Missouri on the 28th of December at Fenwick's settlement near the mouth of Apple Creek. They moved on to St. Genevieve, where he said the first pontifical mass in his diocese on January 1st, 1818. He then moved on to Cahokia, where a mounted patrol of 40 accompanied him to St. Louis, Missouri. On January 5th, 1818, he was formally installed in St. Genevieve. During de Bourgh's tenure as bishop, the Louisiana Territory was carved up into states. Ohio, state number 17, in 1803. Louisiana, state number 18, in 1812. Indiana, state number 19, in 1816. Mississippi, state number 20, in 1817. Illinois, state number 21, in 1818. Alabama, state number 22, in 1819. Now, state number 23 was actually Maine, which was not part of the Louisiana Purchase. But Maine became a state in 1820. It's part of the Missouri Compromise, and we'll talk about that later. State number 24 was part of the Louisiana Territory, Missouri, 1821. Arkansas, state number 25, 1836. Tennessee, at least part of Tennessee, would also have been part of the Louisiana Territory, at least the other part on the river, like Memphis, is on the river. But Tennessee was already admitted as a state in 1796, prior to the Louisiana Purchase. So a great deal happened in terms of the continental expansion and organization of the territory while de Bourgh was a bishop. Some of that he had no involvement with at all. That was purely secular politics. But there were some developments in which the church was involved in that region, and which he led. Also during that time period, as the organization of the partition of Louisiana territory into these states. In 1816, the year Indiana became a state, the first anti-papist American newspaper was established by Presbyterians in Boston. The name of it was The Recorder. By 1830, there would be 30 religiously themed newspapers in the United States. All but one conveyed various degrees of anti-Catholicism. Now this, just looking at the demographics, this is a curious phenomenon, since at this period there were so few Catholics in the new nation, And the new nation had decided to include religious liberty into the fundamental law, the constitutional law of the land. So why? Well, one explanation is obviously just habit, that Protestantism in Europe just came into existence by self-defining themselves as other than Catholic. And they had self-identified so long and so strongly as being against Catholicism that they just continued to do so. Even in a nation that began with only 23 Catholic priests in the original 13 colonies. Original 13 states. But there's another factor in coming to terms with this primal anti-Catholicism of what was an officially secular republic. And that is to be found in the endless mitosis that is intrinsic to the Protestant movement. Protestant denominations that had an episcopal structure, meaning that had some notion of priesthood and bishops and some idea of a clergy, were often in conflict with the Calvinist type denominations, which did not have a clergy and just repudiated that altogether and saw that as just as popery. So whereas the Calvinists believed in the priesthood of all the baptized. Yet all these versions of Protestantism could agree that Catholics were the enemy. So that gave them a point of unity. As a result, intra-Protestant ecumenism in the United States could easily coalesce around episodes of anti-Catholic hysteria or simply habitual anti-Catholic slander, as it was something they could all, talk about without having to argue. Okay, so leave that there, and that's going to explain some outbreaks of violent anti-Catholicism that we'll cover. Also in this period of continental expansion, we meet, again, a guy re-enters our story whom we alluded to earlier, a Sulpician named Gabriel Richard. He was one of the many French clergy refugees from the Revolution who spent the rest of their lives building the church in the United States. He internalized completely John Carroll's accommodationist ecclesiology in dealing with the Protestant hegemony in the country. He arrived in Detroit in June of 1798, spent the next 34 years involved in all aspects of the territorial development. So he's one like Carroll who became very involved in civic affairs, became a public figure, which he could do, because of his accommodationist views, that he became a civic figure, a public leader, recognized authority, respected by Catholics and Protestants alike, including serving as a congressional representative of the territory from 1823 to 25. And as we alluded to earlier, he was the first priest to hold government office. But he still did his priestly duties also. He engaged in missionary work among the Indians. He introduced the first printing press in that part of the territory as the country expanded, which produced the first publications in the territory, in Michigan, the Northwest Territory. He published in both French and English. He served as vice president. He served on the founding board, the board of the University of Michigan. He held the office of vice president. He was one of the types of immigrants who became completely American in his loyalties. He was not whereas we met a couple who were different. These guys from France, they only left because of the Revolution. Otherwise, they would have never left France. And as soon as it was over, they returned. But he was one, who was, completely embraced his new country of adoption, and was so loyal to his country, that his anti-British activities during the War of 1812 resulted in his arrest and incarceration as a prisoner of war for 3 years until the war ended in 1815. Now, he did not engage in combat. He was more publishing, and propaganda in support of the United States against Britain. But still, he was, 3 years as a prisoner of war. The following year, after the war ended, in June of 1816, Father Richard hosted the Bishop of Quebec, Joseph Duplessis. He hosted him in Detroit. Bishop Duplessis left an account of Father Richard's personality, as well as his accommodationist ecclesiology in action. So this is an account dated June 19th, 1816, which reads in part, "This ecclesiastic," referring to Father Gabriel Richard, "is thoroughly estimable on account of his regularity, of the variety of his knowledge, and especially of an activity of which it is difficult to form an idea. He has the talent of doing almost simultaneously 10 entirely different things. Provided with newspapers, well informed on all political questions, thoroughly learned in theology, he reaps his hay, gathers the fruit of his garden, manages a fishery, fronting his lot, teaches mathematics to one man, teaches reading to another, devotes time to mental prayer, establishes a printing press, confessions for all people, imports carding and spinning wheels to teach women of this parish how to work, leaves not a single act of his parochial register unwritten, goes on sick calls at very great distance, writes letters to and receives from all parts, preaches on every Sunday and holy day, both lengthily and learnedly, enriches his library, spends whole nights without sleep, walks for whole days, loves to converse, receives company, teaches catechism to his young parishioners, supports a girls' school under management of female teachers, whom he directs like a religious community, while he gives lessons in plain song, that's chant, Gregorian chant, to young boys assembled in a school he has founded, leads a most frugal life, is in good health, as fresh and able at the age of 50 as one usually is at 30. Richard arranged a ceremony of introduction of Bishop Duplessis to Louis Cass, C-A-S-S, who was governor of the Michigan Territory, and to a general, Alexander Macomb, who was the senior military commander at Detroit. Bishop Duplessis' description includes this, and so now back to the quote. The Abbé Richard, that's just a French, the French, they would refer to priest either as Père, P-E-R-E, or as Abbé, A-B-B-E, meaning father. Both mean father. The Abbé Richard, who had summoned all these guests without the participation of the Bishop of Quebec, meaning that it was a surprise. Now, when he says the Bishop, Duplessis is referring to himself in the third person. Duplessis is the Bishop of Quebec, but he's writing this, so he's saying the Abbé Richard, who had summoned all these guests without the participation of the Bishop of Quebec, so that's a circumlocution for saying he was surprised. Placed him simply between the governor and the general, and served them on a rather badly disposed table, a dinner too abundant in meat, too scant in vegetables, in too small an apartment, whose windows were missing, a shower of rain driven by the southerly wind, which occurred during the repast, sprinkled the chief guests. They would have desired to have the windows closed, but there were none to close. So they had to anyway, so skipping down. It must be remarked that these two dignitaries, meaning the governor and the general, had quite recently received from Father Richard an honor that the Catholic clergy do not ordinarily grant to Protestants, See, the accommodationist. Which was that at the solemn procession of Corpus Christi, that's the feast of the body and blood of the Lord, the 13th of the same month, he had invited them to hold the ribbons of the canopy under which the Blessed Sacrament and he, the canopy, for the Corpus Christi, the body and blood of Christ, one of the liturgical options that can be done on that is a procession. So the Blessed Sacrament, the host, is put in a monstrance. So it's like an artistic way to express the Son. So you have the host in the center, and with like rays, So if it's gold, make a ray, and then it's mounted on top of a not a post, but a cylinder, or on top of a cylinder that can be held, and because it was outdoors, they could have rain, and so there'd be a canopy for practical reasons. But then as things develop, the canopy becomes very ornate, and it was considered a great honor, for someone to hold the ribbon. I mean, to hold the post of the canopy over that. Especially now for Protestants, it's especially striking because difference on belief in the real presence of Christ, which is what Corpus Christi celebrates, is something universal in the Protestant, like none of the Protestant denominations agree with Catholics on that. Now they also don't all agree with each other on that. Some think it's purely symbolic. It's just a commemoration of the Lord's Supper. But there are others like the Lutherans who believe in consubstantiation. But they all disagree with us. So it's striking both that Richard would do this, honor them in that way, and that they would accept. So again, this is Bishop Carroll's influence of how, this is what he saw was best for the church to deal with this, with an American republic. All right, so Bishop Duplessis notices this. The parishioners had not been in general edified by such a mixture, so not everybody agreed with Father Richard, and had justly complained of this novelty. The Abbé Richard justified his conduct by what the Bishop of Baltimore, John Carroll, had given as a principle to his clergy, namely, to do toward the Protestants all that might draw them to the Catholic Church. An excellent principle, so long as it does not violate the rules of essential points. So Bishop Duplessis didn't like that, but he does acknowledge that Richard did have a reason for doing it. Anyway, Father Richard died at his post in Detroit on September 13th, 1832, of cholera, which he contracted while bringing the sacraments to the victims of an outbreak of that disease. He was 64 years old. October 1817, President and Mrs. James Monroe moved back into the now restored President's Mansion, the White House. Remember, it got burned down in the War of 1812, so it had to be rebuilt so that they could start using it again in October of 1817. The ranking prelate of the country, the Most Reverend Leonard Neal, 2nd Archbishop of Baltimore, died the same year, June 18th, 1817. He was followed as 3rd Archbishop of Baltimore by Ambrose Maréchal, Maréchal. Maréchal was born in France, Orléans, France, on the 28th of August, 1764, into a prosperous family. Initially studied for the profession of law, but later entered the Sulpician Seminary in Orléans, where he received tonsure in 1787. So I should mention, we don't do it this way anymore, but prior to Vatican II, from antiquity, from the 2nd century up to Vatican II, there were eight holy orders, 4 minor holy orders and 4 major holy orders. So for the minor, there'd be the ostiarius, the lector, the exorcist, the subdeacon. And subdeacon is where the guy would make his commitment to celibacy and later also take the oath against modernism. Then the 4 major orders were a diaconate, priesthood and bishop, diaconate, priesthood, bishop. I'm missing one. I missed acolyte. That's so I missed Ostiarius, lector, exorcist, acolyte, the four minor orders. Then the four major. The subdeacon is the first of the major orders. That's where you take the commitment to celibacy. So it's subdeacon, deacon, priest, bishop. Tonsure was the ceremony where one was admitted to the clerical state. So when you were tonsured, that's where you would begin. So it was not considered an order, one of the 8 orders in itself, but that's where you would be admitted to it, to the clerical state. So that's what that means. He was tonsured in 1787. When the French Revolution wrecked his country, Mareschal fled to Bordeaux, as many we've already met. He was ordained in hiding in 1792. On the day of his ordination, and at the risk of his life, he sailed for America, accompanied by Gabriel Richard, whom we just met, and Francis Metairie, whom we met in Boston, as well as many others. They arrived in Baltimore on June 24th, 1792. Mareschal served in Maryland as a teacher and a parish priest until appointed coadjutor to Archbishop Francis Neal of Baltimore, meaning a fully ordained bishop and automatic successor. The brief of appointment had not even reached Baltimore when Archbishop Neal died. So Mareschal could not be ordained bishop, or Archbishop of Baltimore, until December 14th, 1817. When he was finally able to be ordained, the ceremony was presided over by Bishop Chevereux of Boston, whom we've already met. During Mareschal's tenure as Archbishop of Baltimore, the diocese was carved up again, creating 2 more dioceses, the Diocese of Richmond, Virginia, and the Diocese of Charleston, South Carolina. After a year as Archbishop of Baltimore, Mareschal wrote to Lorenzo Cardinal Lita, then serving as prefect of the Propagation of the Faith, which is the Roman office of the Curia that presided over missionary activities. And the United States was considered missionary territory until 1908. He wrote as follows. This letter is dated October 1st, 1818. He wrote in part, quote, "Your Eminence, having returned to Baltimore, after a visit to most of the missions in my diocese, I have undertaken to commit to writing the present status of the Catholic Church in these regions, to the extent that it is known to me." He goes on for a while. Now, pick up the quote again. "The Diocese of Baltimore includes the following provinces, namely Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and that vast territory which is contained in the limits of Georgia, the Floridas, Tennessee, and the Mississippi River. Before the American Revolution, there were at most 10,000 Catholics in the aforesaid provinces. At present, there are at least 100,000 in these same regions, the greatest part of them residing in Maryland. This multitude of the faithful, favored by divine providence, is increasing marvelously by the natural process of generation, by the conversion of Protestants, and especially by the immense number of Europeans who immigrate to our republic every year." All right, then he goes on and gives some statistics. I'll just summarize those. He enumerated that his diocese had 52 priests, 1 Italian, 3 Germans, 4 English, 7 Belgians, 11 Irish, 14 French, and 12 American-born, but with ethnic background not specified. Now, continuing the quote. "In like manner, the Catholic faith has been introduced into our American Union by the work and zeal of priests from Europe, and they still continue to serve and propagate the faith here. Therefore, it is not surprising that the American clergy is made up chiefly of missionaries, who were born in various parts of Europe. For my part, I will certainly leave nothing undone that will help build up an entirely native clergy. And yet, no matter to what extent the seminaries at Baltimore and Emmitsburg may flourish, now or in the future, or how great the number of novices for the Society of Jesus, which is well established at Georgetown, I can never hope that they will supply me with a sufficiently large number of missionaries, which would be necessary to preserve and extend the faith in this growing country. He then elaborates more on his difficulties. Marischal listed first the problem of recruiting local vocations. He expressed it in part with these words: "With regard to youths embracing the clerical state, some are deterred by celibacy, others frightened away by the labors of acquiring a knowledge of the ecclesiastical sciences. For this takes a long time and must be undertaken before ordination." So you seminarians, you can sympathize with that. But most of all, they are afraid of the poverty which is suffered by missionaries who exercise their ministry in the country districts. For with but a little industry on their part, they can hope to live in comfort, maybe even in abundance, if they engage in commerce or in agriculture. The second problem Marischal detailed, he expressed as follows, quote, "The schisms which occur very frequently in these regions," now that means the trustee schisms, "clever and impious priests who flatter their people and appeal to their pride easily lead them to believe that they also possess the right of choosing their pastors or dismissing them as they please." As continues the quote, "When Catholics in some part of my diocese become numerous enough to think that they can build a church, first of all, each contributes a few coins to the common fund. And since the amount is seldom sufficient, then they select 2 or 3 men, whom they depute as their representatives to solicit contributions in the cities and villages from their fellow citizens, both Catholics and Protestants. When they have once collected enough money, then they buy a large enough tract of land upon which to build a church and priest house and to have a cemetery. Sometimes they hand over to the bishop the title of possession, so that he is the true possessor of this ecclesiastical property and is considered as such by the civil tribunals. But it often happens that the legislators of the province approach and obtain from them the title of possession, upon condition that they transmit it to 4 or 5 Catholic men, who are elected annually by the congregation. In this case, these men are not only temporal administrators of the temporalities of the Church, as they are in Europe, but they have possession and are considered the true possessors of all the temporal goods of the Church in the eyes of the civil tribunals. And they can, with impunity, exercise over them the same authority they do in their own homes and over their own land. This is the state of affairs at Norfolk, where the impious doctor Oliver Fernandez and 2 Irish drunkards, destitute of all religion, removed from their church a most holy man, the pastor, Reverend James Lucas. Now, this guy was appointed by Marischal's predecessor, Bishop Neal, in December of 1815. The pastor, Reverend James Lucas. So anyway, this is the trustee problem. Yet another iteration of it. But here we have Marischal's own words. Further, Marischal was able to complete the permanent cathedral in Baltimore, begun by Carroll in 1806, and Marischal is the one who got to celebrate the dedication of the Cathedral of the Assumption on the 31st of May, 1821. And it still exists. It's undergone some renovation. And those of you, my Maryland friends, a few of you who are watching this, we actually went to visit it together. You can go see it, and Yeah, and they have, you can actually go underneath the church. They have part of the original foundation. They have it open so you can see how the foundation is actually bricks that they fit together with a particular geometry. It's really fascinating to see. Anyway, okay. In 1826, Marischal made a journey to Canada and on his return fell ill. He died at the age of 63 on the 29th of January, 1829, in Baltimore. He also had a coadjutor already appointed, an automatic successor. This was James Whitfield, who succeeded him immediately as Archbishop of Baltimore. Marischal's body is interred in the Basilica of the Assumption in the crypt, and his heart is in the chapel behind Elizabeth Ann Seton's house in downtown Baltimore. In 1817, the year that Marischal was consecrated Archbishop of New Orleans, the fifth American president was elected. And to him we now turn, James Monroe. James Monroe was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, in 1758. He attended William and Mary College and studied law under none other than Thomas Jefferson. But Monroe quit both college and the study of law to fight in the American Revolution. Elected to the Virginia legislature in 1782 and then to the U.S. Senate, after the Constitution created it, in 1790. He was elected in 1790. In 1794, Washington appointed him Minister to France, Ambassador to France. He returned to serve as Governor of Virginia from 1799 to 1802, but was sent back to France by President Jefferson, his old teacher, to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. President Madison appointed Monroe Secretary of State in 1811, and from that post Monroe ran and won election as President number 5 in 1816. Known for his efforts to conciliate the rift between Federalist and Democratic Republicans, Monroe consciously and effectively recruited leaders from both sides for his cabinet. So there's a book about Abraham Lincoln called Team of Rivals, because he did that. But he wasn't the first. Monroe also consciously did it. So in Monroe's cabinet, you have the Southerner, James C. Calhoun, who was a rabid, pro-slavery type. But you also had the Northerner, John Quincy Adams, the son of President John Adams, later a president himself, and then even later, after he retired, he was one who defended the wrongfully kidnapped Africans, as in the movie Amistad, was played by Anthony Hopkins. Anyway, so Monroe was able to bring, and he deliberately did so, try to bring all those together in his cabinet. As Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams negotiated the purchase of Florida from Spain in 1819. That is the Adams-Onis Treaty. In 1823, he promulgated the Monroe Doctrine, announcing that the United States would not interfere in European affairs in Europe, and conversely, would not tolerate European interference in the Americas. Monroe was reelected with all but one electoral vote. And it was said that one person, that one elector would have voted for him, but he wanted Washington to keep that title. He's the only one to have been unanimously elected twice. So he wanted Washington to continue that, so that's why he voted against Monroe. So Monroe's terms, his 2 terms in office, are known in American history as the era of good feeling. Sadly, at least up to now, 2020, that era of good feeling has never been repeated. 1817, the year he was sworn in the first time, there was a further development in socialism. We saw it first invented in 1813 by Robert Owen, who published in the English language, although he himself was Welsh. In 1817, we find the first text on socialism written in French by a self-loathing aristocrat, the Count de Saint-Simon, Claude-Henri de Rouvet. And the proto-French socialist work was titled Industry, 1817. I just give you that for the chronology, and I'll talk about it more in detail in another course. During the tenure of Archbishop Marischal as ranking prelate in the country, Bishop de Bourgh was still in the Louisiana and the two Floridas. He made 3 long-term contributions to the Louisiana Territory. First, in January of 1817, de Bourgh visited Mother Madeleine Sophie Barat, B-A-R-A-T, to request that she send some of her nuns, the religious of the Sacred Heart, to educate girls in his diocese. One enthusiastic volunteer was the 47-year-old Mother Rose Philippine Duchesne, who led a group of 4 sisters in pursuit of her dream of teaching the faith to Native Americans. Joining the group were 3 members of the Brothers of the Christian Schools. Bishop de Bourgh directed them to Missouri, which was still part of his diocese, because he had turned his back on New Orleans, and he did not want them tainted. Or he had such a view, and he may be afraid they would have been attacked in New Orleans. So this lady, Mother Rose Duchesne, she was born in Grenoble, France, into a professional family. Her father was an attorney. She became a visitation nun in 1788. The convent was closed, and religious life was outlawed when the French Revolution turned homicidal in 1792. She returned home to her family, continued to carry out good works as she was able. She returned to religious life when the Concordat of 1801 restored France to union with Rome, at least temporarily. She joined the newly formed Society of the Sacred Heart in 1804, established the first convent of the society in Paris in 1815. She spent her first years in Missouri teaching white settlers, and her final years working with Native Americans. Her community arrived in the Louisiana Territory on May 25, 1818. By the time of her death, she had established 6 houses of the Society of the Sacred Heart in the Mississippi River Valley. 3 Christian brothers were sent to staff St. Genevieve Academy on the 3rd of January, 1819. Second, long-term contribution of de Bourgh to the Louisiana Territory. In 1823, a financial crisis in Maryland forced a group of Belgian Jesuits to seek a new home. Bishop de Bourgh applied for participation in what today would be called a faith-based initiative of the federal government, specifically for the funding of schools to teach Native Americans. Now, the federal government's interest in it was to teach basic literacy and, reading, writing, arithmetic, that kind of thing. So the grant was approved. So de Bourgh applied for that, said, yeah, we can do that. We can teach in that. But it also would also fund the presence of ecclesiastics who they could not teach religion during school hours, but they would be there on the reservation, so they could teach religion at other times. The grant was approved, and 7 pioneer Jesuits, most prominent among them, the renowned missionary to the Native Americans, Pierre de Smet, moved their ministry to St. Louis, Missouri. Bishop de Bourgh situated them on a farm in Florissant, in the vicinity of the Religious of the Sacred Heart. A few years later, these same Jesuits would take over St. Louis College, the successor of St. Louis Academy, which institutionally evolved into what still exists as St. Louis University. Further, Bishop DuBourg established the first seminary in the Mississippi River Valley in 1818. It was the second seminary in the United States. The first was St. Mary's in Baltimore. He called his, in Missouri, also St. Mary's, was located in Perry County, Missouri, not New Orleans, because he had written off New Orleans. The institutional successor of this Missouri St. Mary's is the seminary that still survives as Kenrick Lennon in the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And that was named for two famous later archbishops of St. Louis, Peter Kenrick, whom we met his brother Francis already, and Glennon was a later guy in the 20th century. In 1826, Bishop DuBourg made his last trip to Missouri, visited Perryville, St. Genevieve, and St. Louis, where he attempted, and thought he succeeded, in well, I'll skip that part. He left St. Louis by steamboat, traveled to Europe, where he resigned his post in America. And he later, he was one, unlike Richard, who became completely American. DuBourg did not. He was one, his heart was still in France. So once the Restoration occurred, he eventually went back. He became a bishop and later archbishop in France, and that's where he died. Third long-term contribution to New Orleans, to the Diocese of Louisiana and the two Floridas. He recruited many European refugee priests to come to the territory, always advising them to stay out of New Orleans, describing it as degenerate beyond redemption. Connecting this to earlier material covered, on April 29th, 1819, Bishop DuBourg appointed Father Hercule Brassac as founding pastor of St. Charles Parish in Grand Coteau, Louisiana, carving out territory from St. Martin's Parish in St. Martinville west of the Vermilion River. So Grand Coteau, in 1918, the Diocese of Lafayette was carved out of the Diocese of New Orleans, and Grand Coteau was on that side of the line. So it's in the Diocese of Lafayette. And it is still the site. St. Charles Church is still there, and they still the site of a historic cemetery and the Jesuit novitiate, as well as retreat centers. So some of you seminarians may have been on retreat at Grand Coteau. The Catholic Church in France was by then recovering from the generational carnage triggered by the French Revolution, followed by the Napoleonic Wars. Wearied with the endless internal strifes against the trustees, Bishop DuBourg requested transfer back to Restoration France, which was accepted. In 1826, he was appointed Bishop of Montauban, where he served for 7 years, then became Archbishop of Besançon in eastern France from 1833, in July of 1833, until his sudden death later the same year in December. Okay. Another immigrant priest, not one recruited by DuBourg, but another immigrant priest, to whom we alluded briefly earlier when we were talking about the trustee problem. We meet again now in his own context. This is Bishop John England, spelled like the country, but he was not English, he was Irish. All right, John England was born in Cork, County Cork, Ireland, 1786. Ordained a priest, 1808. The legal disabilities imposed on Irish Catholics by the British occupation imbued him with a higher than usual social awareness of social injustice, which he fought throughout his life. He became what a later age would refer to as an activist priest. In particular, he joined the Irish movement pushing for the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, which paved the way for Catholics in Great Britain to have basic civil rights restored, and then later, subsequently, the restoration of the Catholic hierarchy and Catholic life, public Catholic life in Great Britain, which happened in 1832. This success had been achieved by a close collaboration of Catholic clergy with Catholic laity, because they had no other means of surviving in that environment of persecution. So, John England was ordained Bishop of Charleston, founding Bishop of Charleston in 1820. He refused. He embarked. He arrived in Charleston on December 30th, 1820. This new diocese, carved out of the Archdiocese of Baltimore, consisted at that point of the entire states of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. South Carolina had originally been settled in the colonial period as a proprietary colony. They brought with them the established church, the Church of England. It was only in 1790 that enactments imposing religious disabilities on everyone else who was not Church of England were expunged from the constitution of the state. Therefore, the meager number of Catholics in Charleston consisted of very poor immigrants from Ireland, along with economically ruined refugees from San Domingue and their servants. In 1832, after 12 years of labor, Bishop England estimated that Catholics of his diocese numbered 11,000, consisting of 7,500 in South Carolina, 3,000 in Georgia, and 500 in North Carolina. As bishop, he never forgot the success achieved by the close collaboration of the clergy and laity, and he pursued a means of institutionalizing that in his country of adoption for the rest of his life. This passion drove him to attempt a synthesis of the competing claims of the lay trustees against the Catholic hierarchy in order to solve the problem. In furtherance of this objective, he established the first Catholic newspaper in the United States in 1822, titled the U.S. Catholic Miscellany. It had two objectives. First, to convince the Protestant majority in the United States that Catholicism was not un-American. Second objective, to convince Catholics in the United States that Catholicism was compatible with a constitutional republic, even one that was officially secular. His argument was as follows. First, that Catholicism is intrinsically democratic in structure. In support of this surprising declaration, he offered the following evidence: that the first major problem in church history, which was the role of the Mosaic Law in the New Covenant, was resolved by a council, the Council of Jerusalem, as described in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15. Subsequently, in antiquity, even though existing within the military dictatorship of the Roman Empire, the church repeatedly called councils to solve major problems, even those of a doctrinal nature, such as Arianism, Nestorianism, and iconoclasm. Further in history, in the medieval period, religious orders developed, beginning with the monastic movement, in which the superior is elected, and in which the chapter has a say on major issues such as property acquisition, acceptance of new monks, and can even remove their superior. Further, in some of the great cathedrals of Europe, there was a chapter of canons, priests who were canons at the cathedral, and they had the right to present the terna, the list of 3 names, to fill a vacancy when a bishop dies or retires. And the cathedral chapter also had a say in temporal matters, such as renovating the cathedral and incurring debts. Last item of evidence for that first point Bishop England offered is that the Pope himself is elected by the College of Cardinals. Second, this intrinsically democratic structure actually inspired the constitutional movement in Western history in high medieval England, 13th century England, which resulted in the proto-constitution of the West, the Magna Carta. That, in turn, facilitated the development of Parliament, which in turn inspired, in part, the Founding Fathers of the United States. So the Magna Carta was 1215. It went through several versions. The model Parliament, as it's considered in English history, was 1300. And then, other developments. And all the Founding Fathers, even those who were born in the colonies, they were born within that Anglo context. So they certainly knew of the English constitutional history. Third, so far from looking upon Catholicism as inimical to the Republic, Protestants should see in Catholicism the mother of the democratic movement. At the same time, Catholics should see in the American Constitution, the secularism of the American Constitution, the division of church and state, should see an opportunity to reconnect with its own democratic heritage. Bishop England actually made this argument in an address to Congress, which is the first time a Catholic bishop addressed Congress. Now, we saw John Carroll address the Constitutional Convention, but that was still as a priest. And that obviously the Congress of the Republic didn't exist yet because the Constitution hadn't been written. So John England was the first Catholic bishop to address Congress under the Constitution. And he did so on January 29th, 1826. Fourth, Bishop England believed that the trustee conflicts, the first of which we covered, that erupted in St. Peter's in New York in 1786, and that one and all the ones following, were the result of an overreaction on both sides, bishop and laity, based on a mutual misunderstanding of the situation. The trustees overreacted to the bishop's assertion of authority in matters of clerical assignments. The bishops overreacted, in England's view, to the assertion of authority by the trustees over the temporal affairs of the parish. The reason this happened, in England's analysis, was that the situation was unclear legally and unclear canonically. Legally, the laws of the land, as we've seen, the laws of the new country, were written with Protestant congregations in mind. Whereas the Code of Canon Law, church law, was written with the situation of European Catholic monarchies in mind. The solution he proposed was a constitution for the American Catholic Church. So fifth, in 1823, he set out to prove that such a thing could be done by creating the Constitution, a written Constitution, for the Diocese of Charleston. It was modeled on the writings of Edmond Richer, a French bishop in the 17th century, as well as on the writings of the American Founding Fathers. Bishop England's slogan was cooperate, not dominate. Under his constitution, each parish would elect a vestry. That vestry would be responsible for hiring and firing lay employees and would be responsible for the temporal affairs of the church, meaning repairs, fundraising, taking out loans, discharging debts, replacing the roof, cutting the grass, all that kind of stuff. Whereas the priest would be assigned by the bishop, period. Assigned or transferred. A house, a bicameral legislature was to be created. A house for the clergy, analogous to the Senate, and a house of lay delegates, analogous to the House of Representatives. All the priests of the diocese would be, by their nature, by their ordination, would be members of the House of the Clergy, whereas the House of the Lay Delegates was to be populated by elected representatives from each parish. The number of those lay representatives would be calculated based on the Catholic population in that parish, just as with the House of Representatives in the Republic. Each year, a diocesan convention would be held in which matters would be presented and debated by the houses, with the bishop acting as the executive officer, like the president. The upper house, the Senate, sort of like the clergy, the House of Clergy, would debate spiritual matters, such as scheduling missions, setting policies for the clergy, policies for baptism, for marriages, etc. While the House of Lay Delegates would debate matters temporal, such as, should the diocese buy this new piece of land, thinking that we will eventually start a parish there? Or should the diocese open a hospital? Or something like that, that kind of stuff. They would both houses would vote. Then once they reached those decisions, then a budget would be created. Both houses would vote on the diocesan budget for that year, as well as vote for officers among their number who would sit on the various diocesan boards, the finance board, it's the property board, etc. The first such convention was held in November of 1823. A total of 28 were held in the diocese, the last being November of 1840. After John England died, the practice simply lapsed because his successor felt that it was just more trouble than it was worth. Still, with this in mind, and doing this for the rest of his life, Bishop England never tired of trying to convince his fellow bishops to implement such a structure, claiming that it had solved the trustee problem which he inherited at St. Mary's Parish in Charleston. Now, no other bishop followed his example to that extent, but Bishop England was able to convince the bishops in the United States into meeting together for a series of provincial and plenary councils. They met in Baltimore, and that set American church policy before the creation of the NCWC during the First World War, which developed into the NCCB after the Second World War, and is now the USCCB, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So that has a long history behind it. Now, there were those, the bishops, if they would have been asked, why don't you do what Bishop England did? They might say it's more trouble than it's worth. Or they might say, well, Bishop England, yeah, he said it works, but it's really just because the people like him. They like him personally. So, they like him and they want him to succeed. They want to be part of that. So then they cooperate with whatever he wants. So even if he had not done it this way, but had tried another way, they said, okay, it would have worked just because of him, not because of the structure. Anyway, Bishop John England died at his post in Charleston on the 11th of April, 1842, at the age of 55. Got a lot accomplished. In 1820, the year that John England was ordained as the founding bishop of Charleston, the United States nearly came apart over the issue of slavery, which is, of course, the issue that it eventually would come apart over the issue of slavery and then be put back together again in a different configuration. So this brings us to the Missouri Compromise, March 6th, 1820. Triggered by the Louisiana Purchase and the partitioning of the Louisiana Purchase into multiple states. And I already gave you the list earlier in this lecture. So the United States acquired 858,000 square miles of land by the Louisiana Purchase 17 years earlier in 1803. The political absorption of this region was based on the growth of a population sufficient to organize a territorial government. That territorial government would then petition for admission to the Union as a state, and Congress would vote on that. It set the conditions for it and vote on that and set the bound, decide, what the bound, okay, Indiana is going to be this, Illinois is going to be this, Michigan's going to be this, Missouri, etc. Okay, with that in mind, by the year 1818, Missouri had reached this status and made such a petition. Slaves had been part of the population of Missouri since 1720, when it was still a French colony, so essentially 100 years. At that point, it was realized that the Union of the United States was balanced evenly. 11 states were free, they're all states. 11 states did not have slavery, whereas another 11 states did have slavery. So if Missouri were to be admitted to the Union as a free state, then the representatives and senators from the slave states feared that the numerical imbalance would enable the abolitionist movement, those who wanted to get rid of slavery, to have enough votes to simply outlaw slavery in Congress. So some of the southern states openly talked of leaving the Union over this issue in 1820. Well, 1818, actually. Pointing out that the Constitution recognized the legality of slavery. And we covered those three mentions of slavery in the Constitution earlier in the course. So that, their argument continued, if the federal Congress began to move against slavery, then the federal Congress, in effect, would have breached the contract that formed the Union. All right, so the Union almost came apart over this in 1820, 40 years before it later did. So to preserve the Union at this point, a compromise was reached. The compromise was in two parts. Part one, the Union would forevermore remain balanced between slave states and free states. In furtherance of this, Maine would be carved out of Massachusetts and admitted to the Union as a free state, balancing Missouri, which would be admitted to the Union as a slave state, since slaves were already there. Second, the Mason-Dixon line, 36 degrees, 30 minutes of latitude. So the difference between latitude and longitude, the way you remember it is lat is flat. So latitude is the horizontal. So 36 degrees, 30 minutes, north latitude. The northern border of Maryland, essentially, would be extended westward into the Louisiana Purchase. Land admitted to the Union henceforth south of that line would automatically have slavery, whereas territory admitted north of that line would automatically be free. So, did this solve the problem? Well, no, of course. No. So the Missouri Compromise succeeded in postponing, but did not answer the two key questions raised by this crisis. Question number one, does a state have a right to secede from the Union? There's no mechanism in the Constitution for seceding from the Union. There's no article that says, okay, if you want to go, these are the 3 steps of how to do it. Yet, in the enumerated powers in the Constitution, the last of those says that any powers not allocated to the federal government are automatically reserved to the state. So is that sufficiently broad to encompass the right of a state to leave the Union? So that question remained unanswered in 1820. And the second, of course, is the question we started the course with in the very first lecture, is slavery. The legality and morality of slavery existing in a republic. The Missouri Compromise did not answer that issue. Or I suppose you could say it did, because it was continuing slavery, but just not everywhere, So anyway, that's just what happened. The enabling legislation was signed into law by President number 5, James Monroe, on the 6th of March, 1820. By a curious historical coincidence, the first African-American citizen who was ordained for the diocesan priesthood to serve in a diocese in the United States was Father Augustus Tolton, Tolton. I say coincidence because he was born in Missouri. Missouri is what triggered this, and he was actually born in Missouri. He was a slave himself. He was an ex-slave, born in Hannibal, Missouri. He had been sent for seminary. He had to go to Europe because the American seminaries wouldn't take him. He was sent to the Urbanicum, which was the missionary seminary in Rome. He was ordained in 1886, had to be ordained in Rome, but ordained for the Diocese of Alton, Illinois. And later the diocese was moved to Springfield, Diocese of Springfield. But anyway, he was born in Missouri, the state that triggered this. 1821, 1 year after the Missouri Compromise, Mexico achieved its independence, which is the third country in the hemisphere to do so, meaning a former colony that had to fight a war in order to become independent from a European country. It was the third such country to do so in our hemisphere. We were first, the United States, then Haiti, then Mexico. That's 1821. So we will pause there, and we will pick up with that next time. For the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.